The man behind me who's going to present to us first of all here is from the Canadian Forest Service, and it's Mark Parisien. And Mark, I'll hand it over to you.
There's one button. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot for having me, for the organizers for inviting me. Uh, as Ollie said, I'm working for the Canadian Forest Service based out of Edmonton. And today I'd like to tell you a little bit about the past, and I hope that you'll find it quite relevant to the future. First of all, let's start with some acknowledgements. What I'm going to present today is a scientific project, and we put together a lot of good heads to kind of answer some questions or look into some questions and get some more new questions. This is a project that was funded by the government of the Northwest Territories, and we also got a ton of in-kind support from the GNWT. Lots of work as well from Parks Canada and from a couple of universities that collaborated with us. And of course, that project would have not happened without the collaboration of various First Nations. Our project covered a lot of ground, so we're very fortunate and privileged to have had the opportunity to work in the area. And I'm not going to go through the whole list here, but you know you are, and thanks a lot. Okay, so jumping into things. I like to think, you know, when I'm flying over these boreal landscapes, I like to think of it as kind of this dynamic mosaic of patches having burnt at different times. And of course, it's always changing. And to figure out how things have been changing, you kind of need to peel that onion, you know, like one layer at a time. And that's what this project will do. So the goal of our study is to provide a robust fire history reconstruction for the last 200 years on a road transect from Hay River to Fort Smith. And a lot of what I'm going to present today is based on tree rings. This is a jack pine, a beautiful jack pine. And as you know, the life of a tree is just under the bark. And when a low intensity fire comes in, it might kill part of that tree, but the other part is alive and it continues to grow. And the beauty of these indicators, which we call fire scars, is that you can get right down to the year. When did that fire occur? This is a jack pine, but you can get fire scarring on pretty much any tree, and we found tons actually in spruce. You might think, well, these large fires, aren't they supposed to kill all the trees? And you know, if, as we know, as when we walk into the bush, these wildfires, they're really patchy, and this patchiness leaves a lot of survivors, either as islands or either as a lone survivor here and there. And those are the trees that are going to hold these fire scars. So there's actually all kinds of like clues from the past to reconstruct these fires. In addition to these fire scars, you can look at the ecology of some of these trees. This is jack pine again. Jack pine's the real champion for kind of doing these fire history studies. And you have a fire, and because of all these adaptations to jack pine to kind of like spew out their seeds and germinate and recruit right away. The age, when you see a jack pine cohort that's pretty much even age, well, you know that's pretty much the age of the fire. Now, this transect, it's about 270 kilometers long. We kind of left a few kilometers closer to Fort Smith and Hay River because there was a bit too much human activity. But we split it in 3 zones. So the Hay River zone, the Wood Buffalo National Park zone, and the Fort Smith zone. And along that transect, we have these rectangular cells. They're 1 by 2 kilometers. And we've walked through extensively through every one of these cells to find all these clues from past fires. So if you look on the little caption here, there on the top right, the blue dots are the trees where we found some fire scars and we sampled. So I don't know how many thousands of kilometers we could have walked over these the 3 summers that we did this field work, but yeah, we found a lot of good stuff. I'd like to go through a bit of the process, how we collected this data, because that'll help us understand the results. So there's a lot of planning that goes into visiting these cells. Obviously, we can't walk, systematically the whole thing. We have to target these areas close to wetlands or close to where we know the past burns might have, the boundary of past burns, or things like dunes. Dunes have like tons of fire scars. So we really targeted these areas using imagery and so we could really, we could really find these scars. Now, collecting the data involved felling some trees, of course, so we want to get to the tree rings. But a lot of the nicer specimens were actually stumps and just broken trees and trees on the ground. It is amazing how a snag, how old and well preserved a snag can be. And it's like it's almost like the subsequent fires makes it like more fireproof. It's almost looks like plastic. Yet when you cut it, it's beautifully preserved inside. And you might have 300 years of tree rings that have zero rot. Now, we bring back the wood to the lab and we sand it. So we sand it kind of progressively finer grit until it's so fine, you almost see the individual cells in there. And this is the kind of stuff that you see through the microscope. And we had about 1,300 of these wood samples. And what we're going to do is that we're going to measure the width of every one of those tree rings. Took a while, but we got there. Now, what we want to do is that we want to take all of these 1,300 pieces of wood with the measured tree rings, and we're going to average that. And we're going to build what we call a master chronology. So the master chronology is really a catalog of the tree ring widths averaged for the entire time period. So it's that's how I was saying it's a robust fire history. Well, it's robust because what we can do now is that we can take an old dead piece of wood like this one, and when you sample this, well, it looks great, right? You've got the origin of the tree, which we call the pith, and you've got a couple or a few fire scars in there. But if you can't date it, it's dead, right? You don't know when it originated, when it died, but you can using the master chronology. So because we measure the tree ring widths from this pieces of wood, we can figure out exactly where it fits on that timeline. So it's a really cool technique. Now, this is a mouthful. I'm gonna walk you. It took me a few days to just kind of like digest it, but I'm gonna jump into some results here. And this is what this is kind of our money figure. This is the fire history, and what you have on the horizontal axis is the distance from Hay River to Smith, and on the vertical axis is the year. Now forget about the colors for now. Just look at those little black lines. Those little black lines are the fires that we've reconstructed, either from the fire scars or the stand origin from pine especially. And what has to jump out at you here is that tons of fire. And we know that this is an area, one of the areas in North America that burns the most. And for the last couple of 100 years, we have found all through the transect lots of fire. Of course, there's parts, there's cells where there was fens or it was mixed wood, don't usually burn a whole lot. So it does vary a lot according to the part of the transect, what kind of stand. but it also varies a lot through time, and I'll talk a little bit about this. Now, just looking at the colors here. So these colors, or every time we have a fire, basically we started the timer and looked at basically we colored the time since the last fire or the time since the fire. So when you've got some pink, that's like the first decade after a fire. I mean, and lighter pink is like the 10 to 19 years. So when you have these hot colors, that means that was a young forest there. And when you have another burn, another black line, you'll see that sometimes it burnt young forest, sometimes it burnt older forests. And the older forests here are the green. We've built a couple of these in northern Quebec, and out there, things seem to be a lot more regulated. So you have these really large lightning-caused fires, and 50 to 100 years later, yeah, you have another really large lightning-caused fire. It's pretty regulated. We don't get this here, and I'll chat a bit more about that. But in a way, it's a bit of a dog's breakfast, but it's really cool. That is what I think makes it quite interesting. Talking about that timeline, so this is a part of the Northwest Territories where there's been lots of action the last couple hundred years and people for millennia. So it's a forest that's that co-evolved with people, and you know, just for the last couple hundred years here, you can see a few of the major milestones. Of course, there was the establishment of Hay River and Fort Smith as trading post. And a big one is in 1922, Wood Buffalo National Park being created, and that brought a whole whack of changes in policy, but also people. And then going down to the modern suppression era, helicopters, better detection, tankers, and eventually a devolution of the program, as Brent mentioned yesterday in 1987. Yeah, so when you look at the fire activity over the last couple hundred years, very variable like it is today. But when you know, that our transect, some of the big fires of the recent years, many of you will remember 1981. It's also, of course, 2014, 15, 2023. These big fire years, they've occurred for a while. And the champion here was 1879, where almost half of our transect burnt. It's a transect, right? So a little bit of it is the luck of the draw. But these big fire years have been happening for a long, long time, according to our tree rings. Now, just getting back to this, this big colorful figure here, I'd like to talk about a particular part of the transect, looking at the area close to Fort Smith. We found tons of fire scars there, tons and tons of fire scars. And when you look at these, like the sequence between these little black lines, you can see that there was fire every 10, 15 years for a while. Last 100 years, not so much. A lot of the forests that we've seen, and you kind of, again, you can see these green areas, these green squares here, they indicate older forest. And of course, the forest has grown, but it wasn't always like that. And look at this sample, for example. So we have the origin of that fire in 1840, and then you have 5 fire scars, kind of in pretty close succession. But we've seen this over and over and over again. In the early 1900s, not so many fires anymore. And we know all this. But one thing we might, you know, we might have overlooked is all the fires that we got before that, those early 1900s, and around Fort Smith, there were tons. These forests where you've had historically lots of burning, well, some of them are still pretty open, and they've got these big jack pines. It almost looks like a forest from the Southwest United States, you know, like we these low intensity fires come in, they scar the trees, but they behave nicely. And I think they're beautiful forests, and they, you know, in terms of fire behavior potential, because you don't have all of these ladder fuels, the fire tends to remain at the surface, or it can anyway. Now, looking at these scars again, that's close to Fort Smith. When I'm looking at this, you see you've got 4 fire scars here, and there's, really just about 10, 12 years between fire scars. Fires all coming in from the same direction. That's not lightning. At least I don't think it's lightning. It doesn't have that kind of randomness of in time and in space of these large lightning caused fires. And another really interesting thing that you can pull out of these tree rings is that, okay, again, same old story, lots of fire, and it kind of stopped in the early 1900s. But look at the width of those tree rings after a fire. That's a lot of growth. That's a lot of growth from those trees. And when I see these wide rings, that tells me that this tree grew in a very open stand. It's a very open forest. So my interpretation is that a lot of the forest around Fort Smith for at least 100 years, probably more, was this really open, grassy forest with a handful of pines here and there, maybe some aspen, maybe a bit of prairie. It depends, but things have changed a whole lot in about 100 years. But that really thick, super laddered forest that you see, well, you saw today, prior to 2023, that did not occur in the past, according to our results. So just to wrap it up here, some take-home messages. Once we got the results together for our study, the one thing that really struck us is just tons of fire, lots more fire than many other parts of the boreal zone. And you've had these large fire years for a while. Now, when you've got multiple scars on a tree, by definition, that has to be a surface fire. Those were surface fires. So, you go to school and you learn about boreal ecology 101. It's like, well, it's mostly crown fires. And after the crown fire, there's a seed rain, forest grows again, and then another crown fire comes in 80, 125 years later, whatever. And really, in this area, it's a lot more mixed. It's a lot more diverse than that. It's a more complicated story. Another take-home message is that, well, these fire regimes, that's like saying the sky is blue, they've changed through time. And we know they've changed through time. Looking at the data, it looks to me like there was a mix of human to lightning caused fires. More recently, we have this regime that we may call a more natural fire regime. I don't know that I love that term, but in the past, before we got a lot of these large lightning-caused fires, I think a lot of the landscape might have been regulated by a mix of human and lightning-caused fires. And I'd like to really emphasize here that this is one line of evidence. There's a lot of lines of evidence, and part of me being here is that I'd like to know about stories you may have, your parents may have had, your grandparents, about burning in the area. We don't provide any answers here. We provide, again, one line of evidence, and I'd love to have a chat regarding what you may know about fire in the area. Finally, well, obviously fire controls vegetation, which in turn controls flammability. We know all this, but it's really pretty evident from our results that there was a lot of fires in the 19th century. There's a lot of reports that there were extensive grasslands or lots of patchiness in terms of broadleaf and mixed wood and conifers, some really old conifers, but also just some meadows and some grasslands that have been maintained for a long time. And I think that's what we had around Fort Smith, for example, not the forest that burnt in 2023 necessarily, but quite a nice mosaic. And it's not just our results that would suggest that, but there's a lot of archived pictures that kind of show a much more open, much more broadleaf area around Smith. Thank you very much for your attention. And again, I would love to chat with you. Yeah, any information at this stage as we're interpreting these results is really valuable to me. Thanks.
Thank you very much to Mark. We'll hopefully have an opportunity for a few questions at the end of this session. In the meantime, I'm going to invite up to the stage from Wilfrid Laurier University, Jennifer Baltzer, who will carry on this session by discussing some of the fire behavior research findings that we've had lately. So over to Jen, just as soon as we switch over the presentation.
That's my job. Can I take this off? Yeah. Sorry, everybody. I'm a bit of a walker. Awesome. Okay, well, hi, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here, and it's been really wonderful hearing about all of the different perspectives on the recent fires, especially the 2023 fire season. And I'm going to be kind of going through some. We just heard from Mark, and yesterday we heard from Amy and Joe about different aspects of fire in the past, how fire has been used on the landscape, how fire history has been changing through time. And I guess what I wanted to do with this session, or what I was asked to do, is kind of talk about some of what we've been seeing that's different in terms of fire on the landscape, what that may mean for communities, and thinking about community safety in the face of these changes. So, we heard from Mark and from Amy and Joe that there's been a lot of fire exclusion on the landscape. So there is a history of human use of fire. There's also a more recent history of fire suppression. And then layered on this is climate warming. High latitudes are warming faster than any other part of the planet. And this is leading to changes in the way fire behaves on the landscape, as all of you are very well aware. So, in the last 10 years, we've had the two biggest fire seasons on record for the Northwest Territories. 2014, which was one of those years. We heard yesterday from Rodney, that's something we haven't seen. And these surprises we see during fire seasons. 2014 was certainly one of those fire seasons, and then 2023 exceeded 2014 in terms of some of the behaviors and certainly in terms of the scale of the fires. And this is just a map of those two fire seasons overlain. I'm going to trip on this, so if I fall, someone can come rescue me. How do I? There's lots of emergency service people in the room. Which of these buttons is the right one? Nope. I didn't want to change the slide. I wanted a laser. Oh, center. Okay, amazing. The obvious one. So we've got these big patches of dark orange that are from 2023, the big patches of dark red from 2023, big patches of orange from 2014. And you can see, this is, again, something you've seen before, but this massive area around Great Slave Lake that has, much of which has burned over the last 10 years and impacted many, many communities in the interim. Yeah, so one of the things that, and so this is not a research finding per se, but something we've been hearing about lots and has big impacts for communities, is the rate that these fires move across the landscape in these big fire years. And this is the fire that was outside Betchico, just kind of making a run. So ZF 015 making a run. This is from ECC, and these fires are moving across the landscape really fast. And we saw this in 2023. These fires just and I've heard from quite a number of fire managers how winds seem to be changing, seem to be driving burning conditions that move much faster and in less predictable ways than we maybe have seen in the past. And so this is just something that we need to be thinking about when we're considering community safety, is how fast these fires can change. And again, we saw that in 2023. We've heard a lot about that and how fast that means people have to be ready to respond. Something we heard about a little bit yesterday, and I'll expand a bit on. So this is a map of short interval reburning from 2023. And so these colors correspond with how far back in time the last fire was. So yellow, and a lot of this is yellow or brown. The yellows and the browns are forests that were 10 or 20 years old when they reburned in 2023. There was 400,000 hectares of forest that was younger than 20 years old that reburned in 2023. That was 10% of all of the burned area from the 2023 fire season. This is quite an astonishing number. From other studies that have looked at short interval reburning, we're talking about, typically the reburning area is somewhere between 2 and 5%. And in NWT in 2023, we saw 10% that was less than 20 years old. And that's, these are also fairly short interval reburns. And when you're talking about, say, a 30-year-old. So you can see these vast areas that reburned that were fairly young forests. And yeah, this value is fairly high. So this is something that was a surprise when we look at the numbers for that. Now, of course, we heard yesterday about these short interval high intensity reburns. This is actually from Salt Mountain. We heard about that yesterday down around Smith, the kind of moonscape situation we think about when we think about these short interval reburns. So they can certainly cause problems, and from both a forest recovery perspective. So most of the time I work on how forests recover after fire. So if anyone wants to talk about that after the fact, I'm really happy to. And something like this, it's gonna be hard and take a long time for that to recover from this kind of compounding disturbance event. But the other thing is if we look around some of the communities that were impacted really heavily in the 2014 fire or 2023 fire season, there was a lot of short interval reburning happening around those communities. And this is something that in the past, fire managers have been able to count on these young forests as serving to slow fire on the landscape, to stop fire on the landscape. And in 2023, we were seeing that happening less. And so these young forests were burning quite readily. And one of Mark's colleagues, Ellen Whitman, has done some nice work showing that you just need to have a little bit hotter, a little bit drier conditions in this system, and it will push those young forests to act very, very effectively as fuels. So this is something we need to be thinking about in the context of community safety. And then after the fact, so this is kind of more up my alley, but after the fact, when we think about what are those forests around these communities going to look like, are they going to recover as they have in the past? So this is a nice spruce forest. This is from Alaska, but similar kinds of systems. So this is a nice spruce forest that's burned once since 1965. And then here's one that has had a second reburn. So this recovers to spruce. Here we have it recovering to aspen. We see a lot of this in the NWT. You're driving along Highway 3, there's a lot of spruce forest that's recovering to aspen. If you have a couple of short interval reburns, it sort of thins out that aspen, so you have a much more open, more stunted kind of stand. And then when you have 3 short interval reburns, kind of in short succession, you end up with this kind of shrubby system, or maybe, as Mark mentioned, something more like a grassland. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but they're changes that we can probably expect in the context of some of this kind of reburning that we're seeing. And if we think about, so this is a different way of looking at those short interval reburns. Here we have the number of reburns since 1965. So purple is 2, green is 3, yellow is 4. We don't see a lot of yellow, but we see a lot of green. So lots of places in the landscape that have had 3 fires in the last, since 1965, which is in keeping with some of what Mark's describing in some of his data, but just kind of a summary of what we've seen from the 2023 fires. And so I think again, tying this back to some of what we've heard about already, not all of these short interval reburns are necessarily super high intensity, moonscape producing fires. So here's, and this is one of Mark's nice cookies. Obviously, you can have lots of regular burning and it creates nice open stands, as Mark was describing. This is a situation where you have a little bit of a mixed severity reburn, where we have some trees that I'm not sure if these are alive or just dead standing, and they'll release some nice seeds. Some places where we've had a lot of combustion of the woody biomass from the 2014 fires on the ground, but then also some young stuff that is still standing in the background, and lots of lovely regen of plants that are in the system. So it's not kind of this demolition of the whole system. So these don't necessarily need to be kind of devastating fires. And so one of the things we're going to be working on moving forward is trying to understand the impacts of these from an ecological perspective, but also trying to understand, we'll be working on some modeling studies to try to understand why sometimes young forests will help resist fire, and in other times those fires are able to burn through. So we'll be doing a little bit of a postmortem on that from the 2023 fire season. You know, there's other, in addition to the kind of young stands, there's other less flammable landscapes that are burning quite readily as well when we have these really big fire years. So here's a nice treed fen, or it was a treed fen originally. So this is actually a short interval fire too. This fen, the first time we visited it was after the 2014 fires, and it was a treed fen with larch. You can see there's nothing much left there, but it reburned in 2023, and this fast-moving fire was just carried through with bog birch, right? Just this scrubby bog birch that had recovered in about 10 years. So stuff that probably we might not expect to be carrying fire across the landscape is able to do so when we have these really hot, dry years. Likewise, with things like aspen around Fort Smith, I was down there not too long ago, and you know, all of you know, there's tons of aspen stand that was burned very, very readily in the fires in 2023. And again, aspen is something we think about as a forest type that really slows fire on the landscape because there's lots of water in the tissues, because it doesn't have those nice flammable chemicals like the conifers do. But that isn't always the case when we have these really hot, dry seasons. And that picture doesn't seem to be showing up, but I think you can guess that there's snow there and there's smoke coming up, so half the picture's there. But another aspect that is an important consideration is this lengthening fire season. So we have, these early spring fires. So Catlodice was evacuated in May of 2023, but these really early spring fires that can happen before things really start to leaf out, and they can move really fast on the landscape. And likewise, we're seeing these, the fire seasons extend well into the fall, and this can really lead to fires that are smoldering really nicely in the soils, in the roots, and the kind of overwintering fire behavior that we've seen in lots of places. I see some nodding back there from Hay River folks, but lots of evidence from across Western Canada that these overwintering fires, when we have these big fire years, we have a lot more of those, and then those lead to really early spring ignitions again the next year in a lot of cases. And in fact, we're seeing some of these overwintering fires that are smoldering for. I was chatting with, I think it was Danielle Allard, who said that they're monitoring one that this will be the third fire season that they're monitoring the same fire that has continued to smolder through 2 full winters now. So lots of things to think about in the context of how the fire season is changing and how it's lengthening outside of the normal kind of, our normal window of what we think about as the fire season, and what that means for, we heard about the Catlodice fire that, the ECC crews weren't quite staffed up when that was starting. And so these kinds of out of season fires are really important to think about in the context of community safety. And this is just my last slide, but, again, and I think it's, something we've been hearing a lot about over the first day and a half of this meeting, but, under kind of normal fire conditions, probably a lot of the kinds of preventative things that we might think about doing may be very, very effective for slowing fire, and fire breaks and these sorts of things may be very effective for slowing fire. When we have a big fire year where you've got, and I'm not a firefighter, those of you who are, many of you are in the audience, you know what that is like, and so you have this big wall of fire coming toward you, and there's not a lot that we can do to stop that when it happens. And so when we're thinking about some of these changing fire behaviors in these really big fire years like 2023, again, thinking about what are the proactive things we can do around our communities to really work actively to slow these fires down, to keep communities safer. The normal fires, probably the things we've been doing are A-okay, but when we have these big fire years, it becomes more of a challenge that we need to, really be proactive about moving forward. And with that, I will thank you, and that's all I have to say. Thanks.
We've got a few minutes for questions. We've got Mark up here. We got Jen as well. Is there anyone in the audience who'd like to put a question to either or both of these guys about any of that? I will start off with one, which is you provided a bit of nuance there, Jen, in terms of reburn and the fact that if a fire comes back through a burn area, it doesn't necessarily mean a raging fire both times. It can actually look different each time. I'd be interested in hearing from each of you in what communities need to be thinking about with those reburns and fires coming back more quickly than they did to burn areas. Like, I don't want to blow that out of proportion necessarily. There's a lot of significant challenges here. But what should communities be bearing in mind about what we're seeing happen in those reburns?
Do you want to start, or do you want me to start? So I mean, I think one of the things, you know, from a when the fire is happening kind of issue, obviously, if those young forests aren't serving to slow or stop fires, that creates challenges during those fire events for communities. And so it adds to the areas that we have to be thinking about as you know, fuel sources. After the fact, if we're thinking about, you know, using the land around communities after some of these fires, you know, I think, well, maybe one of the things I guess I would say is better understanding where, you know, where we have really severe burning associated with these short interval fires and where we have kind of gentler burning, and what that means in terms of thinking about fire behavior, but also recovery of the lands around communities after these events. I think that's something we probably don't have a very good handle on, and I think we probably need a bit more information about.
Yeah, so when I think about fire around communities, there's fire occurrence, and there's fire intensity, and to me they're different, but they're the two sides of the same coin. So if you reduce the fuels to the point where you're just not gonna get those dangerous intensities, might still be fast moving, it might still be dangerous, it might still be scary, but you can deal with it. And when I look about you know, what's going on elsewhere in the world and in the boreal zone, that might have to be kind of a relentless effort. So you're burning all the time, and I think historically maybe there's been a lot more spring burning. It's something I'd like to chat with some folks, but if you're kind of burning once, burning twice, maybe 3 times, maybe that's not enough. Maybe you got to go in every year, every second year. But if those flames come in and there's just not that fuel to burn intensely, you've got a little bit more to play with, right? So yeah, I don't have a solution, but I think that just going back to my tree rings, if you burnt that forest pretty regularly and it kept reinforcing a surface fire regime, a low intensity regime, yeah, it seems like you got a lot more options.
I think, oh, we have one down here.
Thanks. Just, it's along the same lines, the question, but when we look at a fire-impacted community, so the forest, maybe the community not directly impacted, but a fire on the border of a community, you know, when we look at our fire behavior modeling and the planning for that community post-fire event, the fuel profile has changed because that, you know, that material has burnt. But we kind of looked at as either a grass fuel now or a non-fuel when we look at some of these prediction models around the community for a number of years. But is your research showing that those fuel profiles will change back into another hazard sooner than what we're doing now? Because I've seen some of these fuel profiles, well, we had a fire 10 years ago, so it's still fine. But, you know, indications are now is that those reburns can still be intense if we have another fire in that area or another fire that feeds into that area. So I guess my question is do we need to relook at our fuel profiles around communities on when we change that back into a hazardous fuel around the community?
Yeah, so I think that things are so case specific. And I always, I'm an ecologist by training, so I always like to think of mosaics and kind of, habitat and, patches that keep a lot of critters happy. But just kind of going back to kind of something I said earlier, so that fuel profile, you've had a wildfire, or you've had a cultural burn, or you've had some prescribed burning, and it might in fact come back to something that's pretty flashy, pretty dangerous, but then again, that's some of that's in your control, right? You can burn again and again and again and again, at least to kind of create this patchiness and really knock back some of the fuels. I think that if you burn enough, as Jen showed in some of her slides, ecologically it might be bad, ecologically it might be not so bad. Honestly, I don't have an answer for that, but I think that several burns will knock back your fuels enough to really prevent. And we've seen it in Alberta just last week. Grass fires, holy cow, burnt part of the Ukrainian village. Some pretty sad images there. But yeah, so I think there's going to be a conversation in that part of the world about a lot more spring or fall burning to kind of just knock back some of that flashy fuel, some of that biomass.
And yeah, I mean, I would 100% agree with what Mark has just said, but then also probably thinking about the context. And so, in some years it may be the case that those areas don't act as that they act as grass fuels or whatever. And then in other years, like 2023, where everything is so dry that you just have to change the way you're thinking about some of those parts of the landscape. And so again, it speaks to kind of needing to take a proactive approach and think about, okay, are there ways that in some of these areas we maintain a lower fuel load, or if we know that, I mean, a lot of those 2014 fires, for example, the stems had really started to come down, and so you have some nice slash piles over large areas. Are those places we need to think about around communities doing some work in to reduce fuels when that starts to happen? I mean, so I think it's probably, again, we're talking about these being problematic during extreme years, but then those extreme years, and those are the times where we have all of this kind of all of these challenges. So yeah, I think probably at certain times we do have to think about them as different fuel sources, and so then how do we manage those proactively so they don't become problems, or so we can expect them to behave the way we'd like them to around communities.
Okay. Thank you very much. We are out of time. I'm sorry about that, but thank you to Jen. Thank you to Mark so much for coming here today and being a part of this and sharing that knowledge.